Okay, come on in. We're going to begin. And Rabbi Mark, is this for you?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me let you put that on. Come on in, everyone. Good morning. Yeah. Hope everyone slept well on this beautiful fall day in New England. Well, you would have slept well last night during a beautiful fall evening. Did you see the moon last night? Wasn't it beautiful? Oh my gosh, full moon, just gorgeous. Yeah. So we'll wait for some of the rest of the gang. We're live streaming. Hello, world. A big shout out to my son Dan, who's watching from Florida. Hello, Dan. Okay. And everyone else who's watching from different congregations, different places around the United States, and who knows where else. What a privilege it is to be able to share such wonderful teaching with people everywhere, you know. Again, a giant thank you to Ralph Zazula. That man right over there making all the sound happen, and it's complicated. And Ralph, thank you again for all of your efforts. And a lot of people put a lot of effort into this. We'll talk more about them later. Okay, Rabbi Mark, are you ready to begin? So let's welcome Rabbi Mark Kinzer for this next session.
For all of those who are watching this online streaming, you can only see me. You can't see the vast throng that is here. I want you to just imagine, I can't count them. The number is so large. Hundreds and hundreds. So in this morning's session, we're going to be talking about bilateral ecclesiology and the new Jewish landscape. As I said, these next three sessions are all surveying the changing situation that we face in the Jewish world and the Christian world, and just in the world, secular world in general. Just a bit of a recap from last night to bring forth a point that's critical to understand what I'm doing this morning. One of the main themes of bilateral ecclesiology was the sense that we as Messianic Jews are Jews, and that a Messianic Jewish environment is supposed to be a Jewish environment. It's a Jewish environment in which Yeshua is exalted, in which Yeshua is central. But it is unambiguously and uncompromisingly a Jewish environment. And so those of us who are shaped by this vision are always dissatisfied when we just have the sense that there's something a bit inauthentic about our Jewish life as a community. And so in the past, when we've dealt with a variety of ambiguities that inevitably confront us in terms of the Jewish identity of our congregants, the Jewish identity of our congregations, it sometimes has been troubling. And it compels us to ask questions and to seek answers. Because what we were experiencing in our congregations was not what we experienced when we went to our local conservative synagogue or our Reformed temple or our Jewish community center. Now, part of what I wanted to do this morning is to talk about the way in which the Jewish landscape as a whole is changing, such that the ambiguities that we have always dealt with in our movement from the very beginning are now simply part of the warp and woof of Jewish life in general, and how that leads us to have to ask these questions in a slightly different way. And an illustration of this I'm going to talk about in a bit is the whole notion of what today in the Jewish world is being called emerging communities. Emerging communities. And these are groups of people around the world in various countries that lay claim to Jewish identity in some way or another. In the earlier years of our rethinking our own identity, in terms of bilateral ecclesiology, there was a great discomfort with this whole notion of people in various places, often from a Christian background, laying claim to Jewish identity. And particularly a concern that we might be in some ways equated with them. Now, I think that there are still some legitimate reservations and concerns, and these things have to be handled very, very carefully. But what I'm going to be talking about this morning makes clear that this whole notion of these emerging communities, for the first time, is now being taken very seriously by the Jewish community as a whole. And so if what we are looking to do is to be an actual expression of Judaism, it's no longer something that sets us apart and establishes us as a Christian reality, to be thinking about these questions. Maybe just a final point of introduction about this, in terms of bilateral ecclesiology and Jewish authenticity, is the issue of Zionism and the State of Israel. The Messianic Jewish movement has always been a strongly Zionist environment. And those of us who began to rethink our Messianic Judaism in relation to bilateral ecclesiology were just as Zionist, as committed to the existence and the thriving of the State of Israel as our predecessors were in the Messianic Jewish movement. But there was a tendency among us to try to think through our Zionism in the way in which other Jews thought through our Zionism, rather than simply to imitate what we saw as forms of Christian Zionism that were in our environment. So what we saw in many forms of Christian Zionism and end of time. And so our Zionism tended to be one that was more focused on the kinds of concerns that are just true in the Jewish world as a whole. The sense that we as a people are bound up to the land of Israel, that this is something just basic to Jewish identity. And that the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the wake of the Shoah was this extraordinary act of God and of God's grace in the life of the Jewish people in history. So we were more focused on the basic reality of the relationship between the Jewish people and the land, and God's favor at this particular time in history to our people. Now, that's just a little background of where I and some of my colleagues have been at in the last 20 years. And now I wanted to do a brief survey of this changing Jewish landscape. And of course, I'm not planning to talk about everything going on in the Jewish world. I'm mainly looking at those developments that strike me as especially relevant to our particular calling and our identity. So, the new Jewish landscape. Well, first of all, what we're dealing with internal to the Jewish world are issues of blurred boundaries. And this particularly arises in relationship to this issue of intermarriage, which has been one of the most significant points of discussion in the Jewish world in the last decade in the diaspora. As we all know, there's been a dramatic increase over the last 30 years in the rate of intermarriage, especially when you look at the non-Orthodox world of Judaism in the diaspora. The overall rate of intermarriage in American Judaism today is 58%. 58%, so roughly 6 out of 10. That's the overall rate. But if you eliminate from view the Orthodox Jewish world and simply talk about all other Jews, conservative Jews, Reform Jews, Reconstruction Jews, Jews who do not have any particular religious affiliation, the rate is 71%. 71%. So, now that in itself is quite breathtaking, particularly when you look at it in historical context. In 1990, 27 years ago, the overall rate was 43%. So from 43% to 58%. If you then go back 20 years to the year I began college in 1970, so that point when the Messianic Jewish movement was just beginning, the intermarriage rate was 17%. 17%. And so when we're talking about a change of generation, what is different about the Jewish world that you, as emerging leaders who will be taking the baton from us, the founding generation, the situation you live in and that you're dealing with, and how different it is from the one in which the Messianic Jewish movement was born into, this is one of the most significant features. Intermarriage brings Gentile and sometimes even Christian spouses into the orbit of the Jewish community, because sometimes the Gentile spouse, the family decides together, we want to have a connection to the Jewish people, and the Gentile member of the family may not want to convert. They may even still have Christian faith, and that may be the reason they don't convert. And so they still, however, get involved in the synagogue. Now, of course, that wouldn't have been possible 30 years ago. But the synagogues facing this dramatic change, if they're going to have anybody in their pews, they are going to have to find ways to welcome these intermarried families, are making place for these non-Jewish and sometimes even Christian spouses, not just to attend and feel at home, but to be members of the congregation and to fulfill important roles within the congregation. This was one of the points of discussion just this past year in the conservative movement, where the conservative movement was making a set of decisions about permitting in an official way non-Jews to be members of the synagogue if they were married to Jews. I had a conversation with my local conservative rabbi about this. He says, you realize what you're doing? You're saying that a Christian who believes that Yeshua is the Messiah, or the Son of God, or whatever, who happens to be married to a Jew, can be a part of your synagogue, but I can't. And he laughed and said, yeah, this doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Now, that's just one of the incoherencies and issues that gets raised through these changes that we deal with. So what we deal with all of the time and have for ever since we were born as a movement, we've been dealing with intermarriage, more so than the wider Jewish world. But now what we deal with intermarriage is simply standard fare for the Jewish world as a whole. And so we now find rabbis more and more looking for ways to be able to justify performing weddings, intermarried weddings. In B'nai Yeshurun in New York, an unaffiliated congregation that if you were put it on a landscape, it's basically like conservative, made this controversial decision this past year that their rabbis would be willing to perform weddings for intermarried couples in certain circumstances. So the intermarriage issue itself raises questions of boundaries within the Jewish community. But I think that what's even more significant about this has to do with the children and grandchildren of these families. Again, in our movement, we already deal with it. How many people are there in your synagogue who have one Jewish parent? I'm sure there are many. This is also a major issue within the Jewish world now. It's not just us. This is just Judaism. This is the way it is. And as the generations roll on, what we have are more and more people whose Jewish identity is ambiguous at best. You know, that they have, what do you do when maybe you have someone who was raised simply as a Christian, but who has one or maybe even two Jewish grandparents? We have someone in my own congregation in this situation whose grandparents, all four of her grandparents were Christian, but two of them, one on each side, were fully halachically Jewish with two Jewish parents. She simply grew up as a Christian, but 50% of her DNA is from a Jewish source. And yet she was not raised with this at all. And so she's, this is the kinds of situations we're dealing with continuously. And these now are the sorts of situations that every synagogue in America is dealing with continuously, not just us. The blurring of Jewish boundaries is simply a kind of empirical fact that we have to cope with. What also in some ways makes it even more complex is that within certain segments of the Jewish world, there is a type of postmodern critique of all boundaries. And so there become these ideological questions as well. You hear this sense of the challenging of unchanging essentialized identities that ignore the inevitable hybridities, that everyone is a hybrid of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or multiple identities. How can you simply break it down to say this person's a Jew and this person's a Gentile? Everyone simply is a matter of a continuously set of fluctuating hyphenated identities from this point of view. Now, I think this is as difficult for us to deal with as it is for the rest of the Jewish world to deal with. But what we have to see is it's not just us. When in our own congregational contexts or other contexts within the Messianic Jewish movement, because we're dealing with these all the time, we can lose sight sometimes of the bigger picture of what's happening in the wider Jewish world. So, blurred boundaries related to intermarriage. But then we also have these blurred boundaries in the Jewish world being expressed in their attitudes towards what are being called emergent communities. Sometimes it's also called isolated and emergent communities. I was quite taken aback over this last year and a half. I have a subscription to the Forward. There were a series of articles in the Forward written by one of their journalists. His name is Sam Kestenbaum. He did a series of articles. Some of them were on the Igbo, this tribe in Nigeria that claims Israelite identity. Others were dealing with the Lemba tribe in South Africa. Another article on the Aba Yudaya in Madagascar. He also did articles on what are often called the B'nai Anusim, those who were compelled at some point in their history to give up their Judaism but have maintained some kind of connection to us. This includes both the conversos, those who are the descendants of those in Spain and Portugal, those Jews in Spain and Portugal who were forced to convert to Christianity. But it also includes secret Jews in former communist countries who, for whom Jewish identity was also very problematic and who often hid their Jewish identity. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of people from Poland and from Russia who discover, when their parents are on their deathbed, that their parents are Jewish. This is not at all uncommon. And in places like Poland, there are many, many of these people who are trying to find their way back to Judaism. In a city like Krakow, there's a restoration of the Jewish neighborhood of the city, and many of the stores and institutions are run by people who have this kind of Jewish background, and they're trying to find their way. Within the Jewish world now, attention is being given to this. It's not just that there are articles in the paper. There were articles in the Forward because there are Jewish institutions now that are focusing on reaching out to these groups. There's one American institution which is called Kulanu, all of us, and that focuses on these different groups. And then there's another group in Israel called Ruach Israel. Both of these groups reaching out to these isolated and emerging communities. And what they're doing in part is a kind of outreach that's also trying to open the way to conversion to Judaism for them, to normalize their ambiguous status. And so a number of people from these different tribes and different groups have gone through conversion in connection with these Jewish outreach attempts, efforts. And then what really caught my attention at some point in the past year was an article saying that the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs was paying attention to these groups, and that the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs was commissioning a research study, a report, to recommend how the Israeli government should deal with these groups. That report just came in the last couple of months. And the recommendation was made that the state of Israel create a new category for these folks. A category which would not allow them to simply immigrate to Israel, but which would allow them to stay in Israel for periods of time beyond simply the 30-day or 3-month tourist visa. The idea was to enable them to come to Israel, perhaps study in a yeshiva or some other context that would open the way perhaps for conversion and normalization of their identity. The point, though, is there's this recognition in the state of Israel, as there is now more broadly within the Jewish world, that these groups ought to be taken seriously. There was an article on this report from the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs that appeared in the newspaper Haaretz. And in the heading, it described these people as Jewish non-Jews. Jewish non-Jews. Now, how much more ambiguous can you get? Jewish non-Jews. So here's another illustration of the blurred boundaries and the challenge that it poses to the wider Jewish world. And these are the kinds of questions that we've dealt with in the past. To be honest with you, they were, to some extent, the kinds of questions I didn't want to deal with 15 or 20 years ago, in part because at that point, they did simply reflect our marginalized status, whereas right now, that's simply no longer the case. At this point in time, for us to address these questions more directly is simply to participate in a process that's going on in the Jewish world as a whole. Okay, a third trend in the Jewish landscape that we all have to deal with is institutional alienation. Of course, this is something that is written about all the time in relationship to millennials. It's a major challenge facing the diaspora Jewish world. And sometimes it's described as the growth of the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. And this is, again, a broader trend. It's not just among Jews. It's also found among Christians. It's simply a trend within particularly American society as a whole. More and more, or we might say fewer and fewer Jews are affiliating with religious institutions or even identifying themselves as Jews by religion. They're alienated from institutional religious forms. At the same time, it would be a mistake to look at these people as though they are, what they're doing is simply subscribing to an atheistic or materialistic type of worldview. In fact, many of these people would describe themselves as spiritual. Just, spiritual, not religious. And this probably relates to the fact that at the very same time as you have this decrease in affiliation with religious institutions, you have an uptick in involvement in the occult and spiritualistic practices and things like that. I think the real main distinction here is between individuals who are able and willing to see their own identity spiritually in relationship to a historical community, and those who simply are on an individual journey of discovery. In the 2013 Pew Research study, showed how among Jews these tendencies and trends that are present within the society as a whole are even more advanced. They're more advanced in the Jewish world. Compared with the overall population, Jews are less likely to say they attend religious services weekly or that they believe in God with absolute certainty. And just 26% of U.S. Jews say religion is very important in their lives, compared with 56% of the general public. Continuing on from the Pew Research study. The percentage of U.S. adults who say they are Jewish when asked about their religion, the survey has this category, Jews by religion. That percentage has declined by about half since the late 1950s. Meanwhile, the number of Americans with direct Jewish ancestry or upbringing who consider themselves Jewish, yet describe themselves as atheist, agnostic, or having no particular religion, Jews of no religion, appears to be rising. Indeed, just 7% of Jews in the aging greatest generation, so my parents' generation, so 7% of my parents' generation could be called Jews of no religion, while 32% of Jews in the youngest generation, the millennials, identify as Jewish on the basis of ancestry, ethnicity, or culture, but not religion. Now, this is of existential significance for the Jewish community as a whole, because the children of Jews of no religion are much less likely to identify as Jews than are the children of Jews by religion. That's also one of the results of the study. And so when you have this increase in the number of Jews simply by ancestry but of no religion, and you look down the road in terms of 2 or 3 generations, it's not a very promising prospect. And then when we look at the situation of American Judaism, and we look at the percentages of Jews who are Orthodox and those who are part of the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, we also see a very fascinating trend. The Orthodox make up perhaps 10% of the Jewish population as a whole in America. But if you look at the population simply of Jewish kids, say between the age of 10 and 20 or 25, the percentage of Orthodox doubles or triples, because the Orthodox get married earlier and have more children and lose fewer of their children to other streams of Judaism or other forms of Judaism. They have a higher retention rate. And so, again, 40 years from now, when perhaps Nathan Joyner is giving a talk to the next generation, getting ready to pass on the baton, you know, the situation in the Jewish world is likely going to be dramatically different than it is today. We will have a flood of those of ambiguous Jewish status with some connection to the Jewish people through their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents. But probably the largest religious expression of Jewish life in America will be Orthodox Judaism. Okay, the next part of the landscape. Now I want to move on to talk a bit about the situation with Israel. And first I want to talk about diaspora-Israel relations and the increasing tension that exists in that relationship. Again, it's some things that it's easy for Messianic Jews to not pay attention to ignore. We tend to be a little insulated. We have our own little Zionist way of approaching things. And it's still our tendency to think that through our Zionism, we are expressing that solidarity with the Jewish people as a whole that we seek to express. The reality is the Jewish people as a whole, our fellow Jews in America, even among those who really do identify as Jews, are increasingly ambivalent in the way in which they're thinking about the Jewish state. Why? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. If you've been paying attention to events, you would know about this agreement over the worship at the Western Wall. There was an agreement made to set up this the special section of the Kotel for worship by those from non-Orthodox streams who wanted to have men and women worshiping together. And at the last minute, the government reneged under pressure from the Haredi ultra-Orthodox segment within Judaism, and it's infuriated the leaders of the American Jewish world, particularly the conservative and reform streams. There has been this continual refusal to accept conversions done by rabbis in the diaspora. Sometimes even Orthodox rabbis in the diaspora, their conversions are not accepted by Israeli rabbis, and that has been heightening the tensions. The Israeli government has taken some policies in its international relations, which have also been troubling to many Americans. We have the rise of various authoritarian figures in different places, particularly in Europe, in Eastern Europe, who sometimes appear to be on the borders of anti-Semitism. And yet, in a strange way, they also express a favorable view of the Jewish state as itself a kind of ethnic nationalist state. We actually see this also among some of these white nationalists in America. And the Israeli government has been somewhat favorable to some of these rather seedy authoritarian figures, and this has alienated many Jews in America. And then there have been various actions by the Israeli government in the last couple of years, which have been viewed by many observers as threatening democratic institutions in Israel. So much so that the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, who himself is from the Likud party, a conservative, gave a speech a couple of weeks ago that was a rebuke to the Israeli government because of various policies it's taking that he saw as threatening the democratic character of the Jewish state. So what we have is this increasing tension. I think it's still the case that those who identify as Jews in the United States have a sense of loyalty and connection to Israel. But it's no longer a kind of uncomplicated, simple attachment to the Jewish state as it exists. It's much more ambivalent. And it's something that I think we need to recognize as we're looking at the Jewish landscape as a whole and how it's changed over the last 20 years. There we go. I want to shift a little bit the perspective and talk about Israeli diaspora relations. And even as what we have is this heightened tension, what's also occurring is part of a long-term process in which the center of gravity of Jewish life shifts from America to Israel. Now, we've seen that simply through population. There was a time, I can't remember, just a few years ago, where the number of Jews in Israel equaled or began to surpass the number of Jews in America. And at this point on, that is only going to increase, that trend. And it's true institutionally. It's true in terms of when you look at European Jewish communities, where do they look? They look now to Israel. They don't look to America. And so even as there is this tension and in some ways a gap between diaspora Judaism and Israel, or at least American diaspora Judaism and Israel, it's still the case that more and more Israel is becoming the center. And again, I think if we look ahead 40 years from now, what we're going to see that Israel's exercising even more influence on the Jewish world as a whole. And that's something we have to face and consider and reflect on. Okay, that's the landscape. Now, what does this mean for us and what, in terms of what we do? I want to offer a few initial reflections here. Again, in some ways, the final session will be an attempt to talk about all of these trends together. So, first of all, I think what we need to be doing is establishing clear boundaries, allowing for a sense that there's always going to be ambiguities. So clear boundaries doesn't mean rigid boundaries. And making those boundaries a blessing. It's not a matter of like building a wall or building a fence around ourselves in order to protect ourselves. Instead, it's a matter of establishing distinction in order to allow mutual blessing among those who are different, in the language of the theologian Kendall Solon. Now, bilateral ecclesiology and Messianic Judaism as a whole rejects the traditional borderlines distinguishing Judaism and Christianity. That's fundamental to who we are and why, as a movement, we remain troubling to many Jews and many Christians who are still very attached to that borderline. We challenge that border, but I think that bilateral ecclesiology needs to affirm and build upon the traditional boundary between Jew and Gentile. In fact, that's the whole point of bilateral ecclesiology. It's to say that this basic distinction between Jew and Gentile is something that is as fundamental as, and this leads to, of course, the other very controversial type of question of our age, which I'll talk about tomorrow, is as fundamental as the male-female distinction. Well, it used to be we could just throw that out and it made our point. No longer the case. No longer the case. That in itself, by the way, is significant. It shows again how when male-female distinction becomes something ambiguous and troubling, then we have to assume that that's what we're going to be dealing with in this distinction between Jew and Gentile as well. Now, this is why I think a responsible conversion process is absolutely essential to the future of Messianic Judaism. Absolutely essential. I don't see how we can possibly look at the landscape that I laid out earlier in this presentation and not see that we have to have some way of dealing with the ambiguities of identity that we face in the lives of people all the time. It would have been possible 20 or 30 years ago when everybody was clearly either a Jew or a Gentile. Not everybody, it was never everybody, but almost everybody that we dealt with. When intermarriage was not an issue, and it was then the conversion question would have simply been, what do we do with these non-Jews who are attracted to our movement? But, that's not now, I think, the fundamental question. The fundamental question we now face is, what do we do what do we do with people who have some kind of connection to the Jewish world? And yet you can't simply say, this is a Jew. It's the category that Haaretz called Jewish non-Jews. When the world is no longer just Jews and Gentiles, but there's this third ambiguous category. You can either celebrate it and say, oh, isn't this wonderful? We have this new, marvelous postmodern setting, where the boundaries are being obliterated, and we can simply celebrate the fact that everybody's really a hybrid, and that these people of ambiguous identity are revealing how all of our identities are ambiguous. That, I think, is a formula for community disintegration. It may be wonderful for individual personal discovery, but ultimately it undermines the capacity to have a Jewish community at all. And so I think it's significant for these organizations like Kulano or Shavei Yisrael, when they're dealing with even these emerging communities, their ultimate goal is to be able to help normalize their status as part of the Jewish people. If we do not have the capacity to do that as a movement, I just don't see what our long-term future is in this situation. And so, I mean, I've always been, since the MJRC established its own conversion process, I've been very convinced that this was important. But to be frank with you, I never felt as strongly about it as I do now. I thought in the past this was just an important idea, a good idea, the right thing. In fact, when I originally was convinced about the conversion issue, it came because of or at least in connection with, my change in ecclesiological thinking. The moment in which I first saw bilateral ecclesiology was actually at a Hashivenu forum. It was our second Hashivenu forum where we were talking about conversion. And at that point, I was not convinced about the conversion question. But it was when I began to see how we had to have Jewish communities that were distinctly Jewish, and that the church world needed to be a community that also had its own distinctive mode of being that simply didn't conform to these Jewish patterns. It was then that I came to realize, well, we have to have some way of then normalizing the identity of people who are entering into our Jewish world, who belong there even though they're not obviously and unambiguously Jewish themselves. So originally my conversion to conversion had to do with ecclesiology rather than these issues that I'm talking about now. But as I come to see the direction things are going right now, particularly those who are facing these issues with people of ambiguous Jewish status, where while they might be uncomfortable about simply having a conversion process for Gentiles, for those who are not in this ambiguous status, realize that there has to be some way of dealing with these folks who do have ambiguous Jewish status, who have a connection to the Jewish people, but it's a stretch to simply call them Jews. We have to have some way of allowing those people to unambiguously be part of the Jewish people, at least in our own reckoning within our communities. I think we also need, as part of this, to figure out what we're going to do in relationship to these emerging communities. And again, it was very interesting that in the articles in the foreword that were covering Kulanu and Shavei Yisrael, almost always Jewish voice appeared in the article, and Jonathan Bernis. as this third group that was also working with these people as a rival and a competitor, and obviously with a somewhat different orientation. But I think I'm not real familiar with all that Jewish Voice has done and is doing in those settings. But I no longer simply would write it off. I want to understand it better. And I think that it's something we have to ponder together as a whole community, how we deal with these groups of people. A final point, I think our communities, our Messianic Jewish communities, will always include some number of Gentile Christians who will never convert. Just as the Jewish world will always have now these Gentiles who are part of Jewish communities, but don't become Jews. And we have to find ways of being clear about still the inner distinction between Jew and Gentile, and not lose that boundary. And at the same time, make a place for these people. That's difficult. But bilateral ecclesiology, as I've said last night, does not mean establishing these airtight compartments in which on one side we have all Jews and the other side we have all Gentiles. Okay. A second point here. And this is somewhat in relationship to the rise of the nuns. And this is a point I want to elaborate on in the final session when we talk about models of Messianic Jewish life. I think that the fundamental issues we have to deal with are not ones of institutions. They have to do with building communities. Building communities. This will also come up in the fourth section where we're talking about changes in the secular world. Fundamentally, what's happening in the world around us is communities themselves are disintegrating. And people are losing any kind of mooring, social mooring. If we do not build communities in which our lives are knit together with one another, then again, I think there is no real future for Messianic Judaism. But I think that I see such communities among us. Obviously, Ruach here is one of them. What Seth and Rachel are doing in North Carolina is another. These are, I think, spots of light, and we have to build on them. We have to find ways of bringing Messianic Jews together creatively in community existence. Ultimately, spirituality is not enough. What, as bad as religion is as a word these days, what religion refers to is something that is historical, something that is oriented around the experience of a people through time. It's not just about me. It's about my life in relationship to the life of a body of people who have a historical existence. And this is something that I think, again, is just essential for our Messianic Jewish future. But community life is not enough without spiritual life, without dynamic experience of the presence of God in our midst. Now, this is another one of those things that has been going on in my own personal life over the last few years. Let me fill you in a little bit in terms of my own biography. I was part of an interdenominational charismatic community for about 20 years, from 1971 to 1993. This was a community that was founded by Roman Catholics, but which was an ecumenical group. And this was the movement of the Catholic charismatic renewal, interestingly enough, began in 1967, 50 years ago. The same time as the Six-Day War, same time as often we would see this turning point for the birth of Messianic Judaism. Now, in the context of that community, I lived in the midst of this, the experience of the spiritual gifts and prophecy and speaking in tongues and charismatic worship. And that was simply part of my life. Now, the community I was part of went through a major crisis and a split. And one of the reasons for the crisis and the split, from my perspective at the time, was the way in which certain charismatic elements were expressed. There were some people prophesying in a way that I saw to be very destructive of the fabric of the life of the community. And so when I left that community and we started to establish a Messianic Jewish congregation in the 1990s, I wanted nothing to do with charismatic Pentecostal things. I saw that as that was my past. I'd even, in an exaggerated, lighthearted way, would say, I'm looking for a nice dead community, you know. Now, over the last 20 years, I've gotten over some of the trauma, and I've been helped by different people to be able to see that there's a lot of baby there, and not just bathwater. And particularly in the last couple of years, I've been trying to reconnect, or feeling I've been led, try to be open to the Spirit, into connection with this part of my own past. Not just for myself personally, but it's because I sense it's something important for us as a movement. Last week, and I think the time here was providential, last week I was speaking at a conference in Kansas City. It was a charismatic conference. This is the first time that I've spoken at a charismatic conference. Not only was it a charismatic conference, it was a charismatic conference that was celebrating the 40th anniversary of another conference in Kansas City in 1977. That was a conference that was, in some ways, the high watermark of the charismatic movement. There were 50,000 people together, and there were denominational conferences in the morning. So you had a Catholic charismatic conference, a Lutheran charismatic conference, a Presbyterian people were in their own groupings in the morning. And then in the evening, everybody got together at Arrowhead Stadium. And you had 50,000 people worshiping together. Now, one of the extraordinary things about that conference was they had a Messianic Jewish conference as well in the morning. 1977, so the Messianic Jewish movement was rather new and fresh at this time. And this was my first personal encounter with the Messianic Jewish movement. Our ecumenical community was staffing all of the administrative positions for all of these different denominational conferences because we had people from all of the different groups. And of course, I was the natural person to be the administrator for the Messianic Jewish Conference. And so the person who was leading the conference was David Stern. That was where I first got to know David and we became close friends from that day on. Now, one of the things that was that I've been reflecting on in the last couple of years is how different that Messianic Jewish Conference was from all of these other denominational conferences that were taking place at the Kansas City Conference. Because all of those other denominational conferences really were these Pentecostal charismatic happenings. These were Catholics who were leaders in the Catholic charismatic renewal. These were Lutherans who were leaders in the Lutheran charismatic renewal. But the Messianic Jewish Conference wasn't like that at all. It really wasn't a charismatic conference in the way in which the others were. In fact, some of the leading people organizing the event were not charismatic at all. The main group behind it was Jews for Jesus and Moshe Rosen. Moshe Rosen was not a charismatic. So what was going on here? What was going on here was, I think, a discernment by those who were organizing this conference that the Messianic Jewish movement as a whole was a work of the Holy Spirit. That just as the Holy Spirit had been poured out in dramatic ways in what was happening in all of these different charismatic phenomena in other places, so the very emergence of our movement was part of the same work of God in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so I've been grappling with this recently on a spiritual level and recognizing that there is some bond here between our movement and this other work of God. And I think that's true even for those segments of our movement that wouldn't identify as charismatic. It's not a question of whether we are charismatic or not. It's more saying that our movement is charismatic by definition. It's simply who we are. We are this work of the Holy Spirit. And that what we have to do, if we are to be open to what God's purpose for us, is try to understand the greater working of God that God is doing in the world. And I'll talk more about this in my next session, where I'm talking about the changing Christian landscape. But the main point I want to make here is that what's going on in Ruach with this very deliberate attempt to find Jewish ways, authentic Jewish ways, to express and the working of the Spirit, the Ruach, in our midst, is really absolutely essential for our future. A final point on this is the reason I think it's so crucial is because what the heart of the charismatic movement is not actually about healing, it's not about prophecy, it's not about tongues. The very heart, I think, of the charismatic movement is encountering the living, holy, loving God in a way that is existentially real and personal. So that God is not an abstraction, but a reality in our lives. And what is a Messianic Jewish community? What do we have to offer to other Jews, if not that? If not the living, throbbing presence of God alive in our midst, in our lives as individuals, in our lives as families, our lives as communities. What I also think, of course, that we have to be is true expression of Yeshua Judaism. And that's what I again was referring to yesterday when I was talking about Rabbi Stewart's book, Converging Destinies. Yeshua is absolutely central to who we are, and our message is about Yeshua. But it is Yeshua within the framework of Judaism. This historic people with its own relationship with God that Yeshua has never been absent from. And so we can never hope to have a future if Yeshua is not at the very center and heart of everything that we are and do. Come on. There we go. Finally, what we need is our own Yeshua Zionism. I don't think we've found this yet. The book I've recently written is an initial stab in this direction. I hope it'll be out sometime late next year. That's what I'm trying to articulate something here. A type of Zionism which is not rooted simply in a literal interpretation of a certain set of biblical prophecies, but also a Zionism which is not simply a reflection of the fact that we're Jews and we have a historical connection to the land. A Zionism which is rooted in the death and the resurrection of the Messiah, where we see our Zionism and God's purpose in the land as something bound up with the very heart of the Besorah itself. So that Zionism is not a separate compartment from our life in Yeshua. It's not simply part of the Hebrew Bible segment of our life. It's something which is founded in Yeshua himself. And it needs to be a kind of Zionism that, in being rooted in Yeshua, also is able to be critical. Takes very seriously Yeshua's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount and other places, which is willing to challenge excessive militarism or any tinge of racism. I'm not talking about pacifism. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not challenging Israel's right to defend itself. But I am saying that if we are serious about a Yeshua form of Zionism, we can't ignore the life he lived, that unique life he lived, and what's so central to his own teaching about the way you deal with evil in the world. Now, what's also part of our Yeshua Zionism, I think, is this recognition that the center of gravity is changing in Jewish life. And I think what this means is the center of gravity for Messianic Jewish life is also changing. I don't think it's changed yet. I think there's still that the American center is still really the international heart of the Messianic Jewish world. My brothers and sisters in Israel, if any of you are watching, I'm sure you disagree. This is a very reasonable disagreement to have. But the reality is it's not going to be that way for much longer. And what that means is we need to be praying and we need to be working towards the establishment of an Israeli Messianic Judaism that truly can represent this bilateral ecclesiological vision. Right now, Messianic Judaism in Israel, as it currently exists, can't do that, in part because it tends to be so suspicious of the rabbinic past. It's taken up the actual secular Zionist critique of everything that's part of the exile. And it's simply trying to leap over 1900 years of history. But I simply don't think that's possible. And that ultimately the kind of Zionism we need is one which recognizes the way in which God was working in the exile to bring forth this new stage of redemptive work in the life of the Jewish people. I think there are signs of movement in this direction in the land, and we need to support them. We need to find ways to nurture these. They ultimately will develop in their own way. It's not a matter of simply trying to plant our own Messianic Judaism in Israel. But there is something, I think, that we have to contribute in the process. Now, in the long run, I actually think that Israel is the most natural place to be the heart of bilateral ecclesiology. It's much more unnatural for it to be lived here. We're always going to be, in some ways, fighting against the grain because we live in environments which are not predominantly Jewish. To establish Jewish communities, particularly Jewish Yeshua communities, is always going to be a major struggle for us. In Israel, it's simply the name of the game. This is a Jewish society. And so being able to establish it there is doable. And then Israel is a natural place to be the center for both Messianic Jews throughout the world, just as it is for Jews throughout the world, but also it has the potential to be the natural center for the entire people of God, the twofold people of God, the church as well as the Jewish people. That is the future that I see, and I think our Yeshua Zionism has to be looking towards and working towards that future. Okay, now I wanted to conclude with a biblical text from Acts, and I want to look at Acts 16, verses 1 through 4, which continues on immediately after the Acts 15 text that we looked at. And so this is the story of Paul circumcising Timothy, or having Timothy circumcised. We don't know if Paul did the surgery. Paul went on also to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a Yeshua believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the believers in Yeshua in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went from town to town, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So, Paul is leaving from the Jerusalem council. He's received his commission from James about the basic decisions of the apostles, and he is going forth to present those decisions in the communities of non-Jews who've come to faith in Yeshua. And he meets this young disciple of Yeshua, Timothy, and he says, "This is the right guy to bring with me." But there's a problem here. The problem is Timothy's ambiguous identity. Now, there are a lot of questions raised by scholars about, at this time, how would Timothy have been viewed? He's got a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother. Well, one of the questions is, well, were they already following the matrilineal descent at that time, such that he was viewed as a Jew and therefore he needed to be circumcised? There are, some people that would hold that. Of course, the problem with that view, from my perspective, is simply that the reason that's given in the text for why Timothy is circumcised is because of the Jews who were in those places. And if Timothy was Jewish by virtue of his mother, and and Paul recognized that, then Paul would have thought that he needed to be circumcised regardless. That's if he's Jewish, then he should be circumcised. On the other hand, if the same thing would actually be true if patrilineal descent was clearly recognized as coming through the father. In either case, the question is why this reference to the Jews in the places where Paul was going. What makes most sense to me is that the issue was unresolved at the time, that there was disagreement. There were some people who thought that simply being born of a Jewish mother was either sufficient to be reckoned a Jew or even essential to being reckoned a Jew. And others who thought that no, you really needed a Jewish father, or maybe you needed two Jewish parents. These things were unclear. There wasn't consensus among the Jewish people at the time, which meant you got in Timothy someone of ambiguous Jewish status. And Paul is in this difficult situation. He's just come out of this council where the whole point was to make very clear these lines, to be able to say, okay, of course the Jewish members of the body of Messiah are going to be living as Jews. We're going to be circumcising our sons. We're going to be living according to the Torah. But the non-Jews, that's not something that we're asking them to do. And in fact, we're eager to give them the freedom to develop in other ways. So this is like this clear sense of a bilateral perspective. That's the message of the Jerusalem Council. But if Paul is traveling with this young follower and others know that he's got a Jewish mother, and some of those people will be thinking that he's Jewish because of that, and some people won't, it's going to be very confusing. And so what Paul does is he eliminates any ambiguity to make very clear, okay, Timothy is a Jew, and he's on the Jewish side rather than the Gentile side of this bilateral arrangement. Now, I think that way of understanding the text makes very clear the applicability to our own circumstances. What we're dealing with is a bunch of Timothys, and their status is just as ambiguous in our world as it was in Paul's world. And if we are going to also go forth like he did and accomplish our mission and our purpose, I think we're going to need to do the same sort of thing he did, which is have the capacity to normalize the status of those whose current status is ambiguous. Okay, time for discussion.
Mark, I want to make a suggestion.
Or you want to have a little break?
5-minute break. Let's get refreshed a little bit.
Great.
Just 5 minutes, and then we'll be back and continue with Q&A. Thanks.
Very good.
Yeah. Maybe talking about that later.
No, I wasn't planning to, but well, I wrestled with that myself. Because, Christ at the checkpoint is such a...
Or representative.
I know.
Like that.
Well, I think what it means for sure is an imperative to engagement with Palestinian issues, without doubt on that. I think there are other issues of kind of almost like pragmatic political type of concerns about that particular initiative. But yes, without question, I think that's one of the things he has to meet. And that's, as we're more sensitized to what they deal with, it changes a lot how you think about it. It does.
And I'm curious because you didn't actually mention the Palestinian issue.
No, I didn't.
In one of these, and I'm sure that's
Yes.
too big.
It would, yeah.
But,
No, for me, it's very much.
very, very Jewish, not a believer. Very, comes around.
Exactly.
She visits. She's like, this kind of stuff. Very, she's religious in her own way. She, goes conservative, depending on the moment of her. And it's difficult personally, which is why I have a hard time now defining my assignment.
Yes.
But that's another issue.
Yes. No, and I agree. And I think that if we are engaged in this kind of relationship with Palestinians, it means, there's something we can do there that other Jews can't do. And so it's also an avenue to express something. So that on my, it is just, it was such a big issue, but in terms of my own perspective on it, very much so. I mean, I'm very deeply troubled by the policies of Israel. Very deeply troubled.
And again, this goes back to the adoption of evangelicalism.
Yes. Yes.
In a certain, dimension.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
Capacities.
That's right. That's right.
But that seems to be, I'm willing to
Yes.
talk through that and engage that in our world.
So again, this is somewhat the goal of this new book
Yeah.
that I've written.
Okay.
And what I try to do in there is not so much argue for my own political position, but what I try to do is argue that that we need to have fewer theological constraints on the practical or pragmatic decisions that the Israeli government should be making, and that those decisions should be based on prudential concerns rather than theological concerns that are absolutist in nature, that say, okay, the whole land, you can make things about the whole land. I think if we could get to that place, then it opens up space.
So much space. Yeah. Yeah. We're not there yet. But
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
The observation that Messianic Judaism century moved to Israel. Emotionally, quite agree with you. But maybe in God's providence, that's not going to happen until then. Because the message
That's my hope. And this is what and I don't know when it's going to happen. I mean, as I said, right now, it's still not the case. I think is still really the main engine But this is why I think we have to encourage whatever we can the development of a healthier form of Messianic. We can't force it, but there are initiatives like I'm very happy that First Rings of Zion is established as a grand center in Jerusalem, and I think that is a very hopeful sign. There is something there in the Messianic Jewish movement in Israel that has great potential.
and I'm familiar with that, and maybe that's part of my problem.
So there are developments there that I think are promising. And, no, it scares me too because I have the same reservation. about this. But that's why I think we need to have this in our minds. In other words, it's not enough for us to simply build our own communities here. We have to be thinking about what's going on in the Messianic movement in Israel, because ultimately I think that is going to be the future of our movement. If we're not planting seeds there, then we're ultimately going to be, I think, undermining our future of the kids. So, I mean, I think part of the idea is to scare us into Yes.
When we're picking people,
Yeah.
instead of going
Yeah, how do you want to do it?
because we have the two mics, if you put one
Okay. Okay.
and the next person.
Okay. Very good.
We're ready.
Very pleased to sit and listen to your thoughts. Your ideas very influential all over the place. I'm sure you
Yeah, I don't really.
all the nooks and crannies of this United States and beyond. But as you were speaking, it occurs to me how to think about how to use a term that might express Jew, not Jew, Jew, but not Jew. And it came to be Jute. JW apostrophe T. Jute. It's like Jew is Jesus. How do you see it? It looks like
Jew.
it is. So how do you
Jewish man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very clever.
It kind of tickled me. I enjoyed that. But it is, and it is a question. I don't know if I should answer the question, but is it, when we're talking about Jews of unknown background, but they have something, is that the same as Gentiles? They might have, or do you distinguish?
Yeah. Good. Actually, why don't you raise it? It's a good question.
If you're going to talk.
Okay. Well, let's have our seats. We want to greet our people in live streaming land, YouTube land. Hello, wherever you may be. We're so glad you're with us. And we're going to turn things back over to Rabbi Mark for a time of Q&A. And take it away, Mark.
All righty. So I was urged to take a slightly different approach to picking people. So instead of kind of starting on one side and going all over the other, we're going to rotate between the sides. So we can start over here with Eugene. Wait for the mic.
Rabbi, you have essentially equated the situation of the conversion of Timothy, the formal conversion, with the situations that we are dealing with in the Messianic world. And I think there's a major difference that renders the situation not particularly relevant. And that's because Paul's conversion, or conversion performed by Paul, was essentially viewed as valid by the rest of the Jewish community, whereas our conversions are not.
Yes.
So we are essentially promising, if we do institute conversions, which I agree with you, we need to at some level, but at the same time, we are promising to take people who are standing in the hallway of the Jewish world into the, into the inside of the house, and yet what we're doing is we are taking them into another hallway. We are not normalizing their status. We are making it even more ambiguous than it was before.
Okay, a very good comment. Pointing out this difference, which I think is a significant difference. The reason I think that it's still, well, I think the crucial thing for reckoning with Messianic Jewish conversions is seeing that what you point out is true of all conversions in the Jewish world. Reform conversion would not be accepted by conservative Jews or Orthodox Jews. conservative conversions are not accepted by Orthodox Jews, certainly not by the state of Israel. Orthodox conversions done in the U.S. by Orthodox rabbis that are not properly recognized are not recognized in Israel. So our situation, while more drastic because we're not recognized by anybody, is still not, it's not atypical of what is actually simply the state of conversion in the Jewish world. And so from that perspective, you could say all conversions in Judaism today are not in any way analogous to what the issue of conversion was in the traditional world, where that kind of division didn't exist among Jews. That's true. But I don't think it means that we can't look at an ancient text in which is dealing with this issue of conversion and the normalization of status and say that this doesn't have any bearing on how anybody should think about the issue of conversion in the 21st century. Now, I think that for anybody who is going through a conversion within a Messianic Jewish context, they very clearly will and should know that their conversion is not going to be recognized by Jews outside our own orbit. We can't be promising them something that they're not going to receive. I mean, at this stage of things, it's even more narrow than that. I mean, the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council is one of the only groups that's doing Messianic Jewish conversion, and our conversions are not even recognized within the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, the organization we're part of. And we have to, and the folks who are undergoing conversion know that that's the case. And it's painful, it's difficult. But the point of it is that your primary community is always your local community, the place where you live. And it really does make a difference for these folks to have their status normalized with the people they see every day and every week. Now, if we are part of Messianic Jewish environments where there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile, where Gentiles are ritually able to do absolutely everything that Jews would be doing, then there is very little point to conversion. But the whole vision of bilateral ecclesiology is to challenge whether that's really appropriate. Thereby, one is really undoing the sense that there is any distinction between Jew and Gentile. And I would argue that in a congregational environment like that, what's really going on is a kind of quasi-conversion. It is in effect conversion without calling it conversion, where non-Jews are taking on Jewish life, and they're getting all of the goodies, all of the privileges that are part of conversion without having to go through any process that requires a set of commitments and education. So I think that the text is relevant, but a text can be relevant without being directly parallel. But I think your comment is very important because it does make clear the problems with conversion that are faced within the Jewish world as a whole, and the particular ones that are the way they're accentuated in our environment. So, over there, in the back behind you, and then we'll come up.
As you mentioned, that the shift of gravity is happening towards Yerushalayim and Israel in of itself, both due to the fact of Jewish people coming more and more into the land of Israel, as well as people leaving the Jewish community and entering more into the secular ones that are staying outside of Israel. So are you seeing, as you mentioned also, you see that the Messianic community in of itself will be centralized in Israel. The community that's outside of Israel, are you envisioning that there will be a lot of conversions from Gentile into Judaism? Or are you seeing that these communities are going to be disappearing as more people are heading towards Israel?
Yes. Well, I don't think that I don't think the diaspora Messianic Judaism will disappear, just as I don't think diaspora Judaism will disappear. I mean, until we, who knows when you get up in terms of eschatological scenarios. If we get to a point where all Jews are in the land, but I don't see that in the near future. And so, personally, I think it's important that there be a dynamic diaspora. I'm not one who thinks that there's some kind of obligation for every Jew in the diaspora to make Aliyah. Obviously, I don't believe that. Otherwise, I would be living in Israel right now. But it's not said sometimes, and I just would make it explicit. So I think there's still a great importance in building a long-lasting Messianic Jewish life here. But I think that right now, that life is still central and in relationship to the work of God in the Messianic Jewish world as a whole, whereas I think that will change as the years go along. So the change in center of gravity is not an elimination of one side. It's simply a clear sense that something is the center of a broader whole. So back over on this side.
In terms of conversion in a Messianic Jewish setting and, clarifying identity, what would you consider a person to be eligible for conversion? Like, if someone had two grandparents, either side, would they be suitable for conversion, or would you see them as Jewish? And number two, do you think, if ever, will the union as a whole recognize Messianic Jewish conversion?
Yeah, yes. Well, in the standards in the MJRC, if someone has two Jewish grandparents, but their own parents were not raised as Jews and didn't identify as Jews, and they were then not raised as Jews, we would not see two grandparents as sufficient. And so this case, that we have, I have someone in my congregation with this situation, and as I said, it was even like one parent on each side, but we do not treat this particular person as Jewish, but we also don't treat her as simply a non-Jew. That we really do think in terms of this other category of those who either non-Jews that are related to the Jewish people, or just those who have a kind of connection that needs that if they choose it and choose to do so, needs to be normalized. And so in those kinds of contexts, I don't think conversion means the same thing that it means when you're dealing with someone who's simply a non-Jew. I really don't, and we should make it clear to those people, because often people in those contexts are offended at the idea that they need to convert, as if we're simply treating them as a non-Jew. And that's not the way we deal with it. We really just see it as there's an ambiguity here that needs to be resolved and clarified. Again, what was the second question?
When, if ever, do you see UMJC?
Oh, yes, UMJC, yeah. Well, of course, as Yogi Berra said, predictions are very difficult to make, especially about the future. So I'm not sure, but what I could say is this. I think that at some point in the next decade, or perhaps two, but I think more likely the next decade, that there will be a change within the UMJC on this front. I can't be certain, but I've had too many conversations with people, with leaders who are outside of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, whose thinking on this has changed because of the sorts of issues I was describing. And so I do anticipate a change, and I anticipate the likelihood that more widely within the Messianic Jewish movement that there will be changes in this front. I do. Now, I think that there could be very, very different ways of relating to these things and how it works. My view, I still see the primary need for conversion is in dealing with people of ambiguous status and non-Jewish spouses who are willing to take that complete step and to make their family as a whole unambiguously Jewish. Those, from my perspective, that's the primary reason for conversion. But I think then there are also these other very exceptional circumstances where someone is not in either of those cases, but has some kind of very clear call from God, that is recognized by the community. But I think that it's that last category which is perhaps the most controversial. And I think that if you just restricted it in scope in terms of the discussion to these other categories, I think there actually would be, even today, a certain agreement among many, many leaders within the UMJC, and even more widely in other segments of the Messianic Jewish community on it. So, okay, Hannah.
Thanks. I have two questions. One is sort of tangential, but if you're right in that the Messianic Jewish community will more and more begin to accept conversions, but I mean, my guess is that we're not going to see a huge influx of union congregations joining the MJRC, or the MJA. Rather, we'll see more congregations with their own standards for conversion and for normalization. Do MJRC congregations? I'm curious, whether there's been conversations about policy in terms of recognizing other conversions, and what that might look like 10, 20 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
And then my larger question was, I would love if you could expand a little bit more on Yeshua Zionism, just because my understanding about the Israeli Messianic Jewish community is that it's very church-like right now, and this idea of having clear distinctions and conversions and foundations in Torah observance seems a very long way off. And so thinking about bilateral ecclesiology as Israel being the heart of bilateral ecclesiology is hard to imagine. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, excellent questions. On the first question, I agree with you completely. I think in the long run, the future of the issue of conversion is one where I would expect other bodies will be growing up within the Messianic Jewish movement that hopefully will learn from the experience of the MJRC, but will go in their own direction in the way in which they're handling conversion. I'm not anticipating that the MJRC would always remain the one body doing conversions. Now, in terms of the question then, well, how would the MJRC then relate to the other groups, or how would any of the other groups relate to one another? I think that'll be dependent on the kind of standards and approach that are taken to conversion in the different settings. I think that the disposition should always be one of wanting to find a way to recognize one another's conversions. That should be the basic attitude. But in terms of the actual decision, it'll depend on being able to say, look at the process that's being followed and to be able to affirm that this has real integrity. And I think that would be important, because being able to have that as a check would also then be an incentive for every new body that arose to want to have a rigorous process and standards that could be accepted by other groups as well. The second question about the Yeshua Zionism. Someone else came up to me afterwards during the break and said they found what I said about that scary, frightening, because they understood well the way the nature of the Messianic Jewish movement in Israel today, and if that becomes the center of gravity, what does that mean? Today, if there isn't any change in the Messianic Jewish movement in Israel, then I think it would be really problematic, at least from the perspective that I have and I'm articulating here, and that many Messianic Jews share in the diaspora. If Israeli Messianic Judaism became the standard bearer. But that's one of the reasons I'm trying to offer some incentive for us to invest in some ways, even if it's only in prayer. Only in prayer. Well, that's not the right way to put it. Sorry about that. To invest in the importance of our future in the land of Israel, and to see that the development of a healthy Messianic Jewish movement in Israel is really crucial for our future as a whole. I think there are some promising developments. I think the opening of the Bram Center by First Fruits of Zion is a very promising development, and I have a long historical perspective on the Messianic movement in Israel. I started to spend time in Israel in the midst of the Messianic movement in the early 1980s. And so I've watched it over those years. And while it may be surprising to some of you, it's actually, over those years, become far more positive towards Jewish tradition and to Torah than it was in the early 1980s. I mean, in those early congregations, maybe aside from the Joe Shulam's sphere, almost no one had a Torah, a Sefer Torah, or a Torah service, and they just looked at American Messianic Judaism as crazy. And that's changed. It's more common now to find Messianic congregations in Israel that at least have a Sefer Torah, and so. I don't know what more I can say other than I hope and I pray that Messianic Judaism that emerges in the land of Israel can be more of a model. But I just think ultimately it's going to be the center whether we like it or not. And therefore we better do what we can to foster what we think would be most healthy. Yeah.
So a follow-up question. I've been thinking about the model that you described yesterday of these Jewish Catholic Jews who are holding a Mass in Hebrew and trying to figure out how to live Jewishly within their Catholic identity. And I don't know if you're going to be explaining this later, but when we think about the bilateral ecclesia and the Israeli Messianic Jewish community, or the Israeli Jewish community who also believe in Yeshua, which side are they on? And how are Jews living in the Christian world supposed to fulfill their role, identity?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and again, I think that this is in process. And it's also part of the complexity of the bilateral of the nuancing of bilateral ecclesiology. And I think right now it's only possible to think about Jews within the church context as being on the Gentile side. They may individually find some way of living as Jews. They may, through connection with Messianic Jews, be able to find some ways of reinforcing that in their life. But in their Christian church life, they're not no corporate environments for being able to express it. On the other hand, what would be the case if church bodies formally established Jewish spheres within their own church existence? This is something that's never been done, so it's difficult to conceive of. But if they did, might it be possible to develop actual Jewish environments in those settings that you really could think of as being on that Jewish side of a Jewish corporate environment? And that therefore would also need to find ways to be linked to the Messianic Jewish life. And in fact, they may need that link in order to figure out how to actually develop their own Jewish life. That's the reason why I'm so motivated for this Helsinki consultation. It's to be able to move into that sphere of possibilities that we've never conceived of, but then it complicates bilateral ecclesiology, which is fine. Part of what I'm trying to convey is that bilateral ecclesiology is not like a structure. It's a very loose kind of way of trying to envision the body of Messiah as having these different kinds of corporate environments. And the way they're structured and the way leadership functions in relation to one another, that could be ordered in any endless variety of ways. It's not predetermined by a commitment to bilateral ecclesiology. Okay, over to this side. Who has the mic down there? There it is. Okay, so Jackie?
Rabbi, when you were talking about Yeshua-centered Zionism and being able to be critical of excessive militarism but not pacifist, I was wondering where Yeshua-centered Zionism would fall in regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Israeli Arabs and the Palestinian narrative, while if it would be being pro both Israelis and a Palestinian state or some form of one state.
Yes. Simple question. The argument of this book that I've just finished is on this question is primarily that we have fewer theological constraints on what is possible than people sometimes think. That there's sometimes a kind of absolutist view of Zionism or of a religious Zionism that the land belongs to us. Once we have possession of it, we cannot give up an inch of it, and any compromise is compromise with the commandments of God. And when you have that kind of absolute position, then the theological constraints are very, very intense. They basically say, okay, there's really no room to maneuver. This is the position politically that you have to take, and it's ordained by God. What I'm trying to argue is that we don't have those kinds of theological constraints, and that it would take a good bit for me to explain to you what I mean and why I think that's the case. But what that means is I think that fundamentally it comes down to much more prudential decision making in terms of the issues of a Palestinian state, or and that I think that people of goodwill can disagree about issues of that are related to security and whether it would be wise at this point to make such and such an agreement. And I have my own opinions, but they're just my political opinions, and I don't even argue for them in this particular book, because that's not my angle. In terms of, though, the Yeshua Zionism, what I do think is important theologically is this recognition that we have brothers and sisters on the Palestinian side. And I do think that the developing of relationships with them and listening to them and humanizing them and reckoning that this story is not a one-sided story is really important. It's not a one-sided story. We can be very committed to there being a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, and still be able to see that there are lots of problems with it and the way in which it functions, so that's my own angle on it, and I do think we need to forge relationships with. And so one of the things that was very positive was there was a Borough Park symposium a couple of years ago on this topic, and some Palestinian Christians were invited to participate. It changed the dynamic of the discussion because we had Palestinians there, and also Israeli Arabs, and so I think this is fundamental to any form of Yeshua Zionism. Okay, back to this side. Oh, yes, your hand was up. Wait for the mic.
So I wanted to get a clarification about how you're defining the distinctive. So in our little group, for instance, we have everything from a person who has, she suspects, Jewish background because of some traditions that came down and because of her Spanish heritage. And so thinks she's probably Jewish and even has a name that could be a Jewish name.
Yes.
And then we have a Gentile who comes in and absolutely just wants to embrace everything and has a beautiful heart. So what kinds of distinctions do we make when we're talking about this Jew, not Jew, or person of ambiguous identity, and in terms of the idea of eliminating the ambiguity? Do we address it differently from these different backgrounds? And if so, how? Or is that something that needs to be worked through?
Yeah, I think it is something that has to be worked through. I don't have a real clear answer to the question. I think it's the cases that are easiest to deal with are the ones where there's some type of Jewish descent which is demonstrable, which is incontestable. I think then the second level has to do with exactly the case that you mentioned, in which we've all, I'm sure, have dealings with people who have a Latin American background, who have had some kind of practices in their family that are strikingly Jewish in character, that have a name that could potentially be connected in this way. And again, I used to simply write that stuff off. I don't anymore, in part because it's being taken somewhat more seriously in the wider Jewish world. But I think that is still somewhat different from the case of someone who has an absolute, clear, demonstrable Jewish descent. And then this other case of simply someone who comes to us who loves Judaism and loves the Jewish people and isn't making any claims about their DNA or something like that. I think these are three cases which, as I see it, are like further along on a spectrum, where where I think the impetus towards potentially something like conversion would be stronger the closer that you're getting to the actual boundary of the Jewish people. So you might say the burden of proof. I mean, I think it's very important that a conversion process in the Messianic Jewish world is very cautious. That we do not want to do anything that implies that there's something incomplete about our Christian brothers and sisters who are non-Jews. And I think that's basically basic to the message of the book of Galatians and the teaching of Paul, which I think has real authority for us, and it's serious. It's not a light matter. It's a very serious matter to in any way implying that there's something where it just needs to be, if you only go take this step, you'll be all the way, and any implication that that's the case is very, very dangerous. And that's why I think we should have the basic halakhic principle is non-Jews shouldn't convert. That's like the norm. The norm is non-Jews who are Christians shouldn't convert. But there are exceptions. And the exceptions are related to the very categories you were mentioning that need discernment in each case. So, okay, back here. I guess the hands are back there. Your hand was up earlier, Seth, but it's not up now, so either one.
So thank you again, Dr. Kinzer. That was a very enlightening presentation. But one thing that I was just wondering about, since being in New York for a few years, there's a lot of craziness that's going on with the Jewish community. I've noticed that there's been a lot of rise of the LGBT community within the Jewish community context. So
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you could talk about that and the trends like you did for intermarriage, and how our Messianic Jewish response should be for that, because it's a growing issue.
Yeah. Well, that issue, it really does fit into this context because of the way you formulated it, this is a very significant thing internal to the Jewish world. But it could fit in any of our contexts. It's happening in the Christian world, and all of it is fundamentally rooted in what's happening in the secular world. So I'm going to hold off and talk about it. It is one of my topics in the fourth presentation, dealing with changes in the landscape in the secular world. I'm still not. I can tell you in advance, though, it's not an issue I'm going to address in any kind of really thorough or adequate way. But I'm going to say something about it and set it within that broader context. But it's the one thing I'd say here is, at one point in the past, it was an issue that was avoidable. It's now an issue which is unavoidable, because it is so much now built into each of these environments. So, okay, one more. It was on this side. So,
Mark, thank you. I was interested in what you related about your experience with the charismatic community. And how, when you transitioned out of that there was a kind of a trying to leave that completely behind. But I'm wondering if how do you see the possibility of a charismatic presence and expression within, traditional Jewish service and the Torah and all of that,
yes,
and in Jewish prayer, and how that would express itself.
Yes. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I've had wonderful experiences of worship in the charismatic context. And of course, I have a tremendous love for traditional Jewish liturgical worship. I haven't yet been able to quite envision how the two come together. It has been helpful for me to experience charismatic masses, in Catholic charismatic contexts, because there you've got this clear liturgical form, this ancient liturgical form, and in there what they do is they simply have certain points within the service where the charismatic dimension is present. The question is, to me, still is how can we do this in a way that isn't alienating to Jews who are present within that context, and so I have no answer. I have no good response. It's something, let's just say, the difference for me is not that I have any kind of answers about this, it's that up until the last year or two, I wasn't interested in the question. I'm now interested in the question. I guess that's progress. Okay, well, I think that will end the morning session. Rich, you want to?
Let's say thank you to Rabbi Mark for this wonderful, very helpful session. I'm going to call, yes, Mark, thank you again for a really, really helpful session. So enlightening and provocative and helpful, and reflects all kinds of careful thinking and a heart that is an open heart to, as we try and discern these things. To be principled and open is a wonderful set of qualities. I'm going to invite Shana up. She has some announcements for us. Then we'll have lunch and go from there.
Thank you, Rabbi Rich, and thank you, Rabbi Mark. That was wonderful. Thanks. I have some questions for you that I'll ask you later. Don't want to take away other people's time. So we're going to be breaking now for lunch, and we will start again at 2 o'clock this afternoon. On the table, the round table, as soon as you exit the sanctuary, there's a schedule on one side of these small sheets, and on the back side, there's a list of restaurants that are in the area. In Needham, which is the town we're in now, and Newton, which is a neighboring town. There are plenty of options. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. And then just make sure that you're back by 2 o'clock, because we'll be starting then. And then the second announcement that I would like to make is regarding tomorrow. Tomorrow evening, we do not have a set dinner planned like we do this evening. However, we realize that Shabbat ends at 6:18 tomorrow, and our next session in the evening starts at 7. So for those of you that might not already have plans for dinner, we would like to provide pizza. We would be able to have it here at the congregation. If you wanted to stay around here and eat pizza, that's basically the option that we're offering, if you would like to do that. But I would like a show of hands so we know how much pizza to order. The pizza is not kosher, but it will be parve with no meat. So if anyone would please raise their hand if they want that option, that would be great. Okay. Very good. And I know that some people are not here this morning, and I'll incorporate them in the count. The last thing that I wanted to mention was if you have any special diets, restrictions, allergies, sensitivities, come see me right after we close here in the back of the room, and I'll just make sure to account for those. Okay? Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your lunch, and see you back here at 2.